Hey guys, tonight we begin with what might be history's most bizarre career choice, the professional sin eater. Picture this. Your job description literally involves eating other people's sins off their dead bodies, and somehow this was considered a legitimate profession for centuries. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together into one of history's strangest occupations. Let's start with the biggest misconception about sin eaters. Most people, if they've heard of them at all, imagine some kind of medieval priest or holy man performing sacred rituals. In reality, sin eaters were usually the most desperate, marginalized people in their communities. Think of them as the ultimate social outcasts with the world's worst catering gig. This wasn't some mystical spiritual calling. It was what happened when you were so poor and desperate that eating a stranger's metaphysical baggage off their corpse seemed like a reasonable career move. Modern equivalent? Imagine if your local McDonald's had a position called emotional burden specialist, where you literally consumed other people's guilt and shame for minimum wage, except instead of at least getting employee discounts, you got socially ostracized and probably didn't live very long. The sin eater wasn't a respected religious figure. They were more like a human garbage disposal for spiritual waste, and about as popular as you'd expect someone in that position to be. To be fair, the job did come with some perks. You got to eat at every funeral in town. Granted, it was usually stale bread and warm beer while everyone else avoided eye contact with you, but hey, free food is free food. And you never had to worry about being invited to awkward dinner parties because, well, nobody wanted to eat with the person whose job involved consuming the sins of the dead. Talk about effective social distancing. The 16th through 18th centuries weren't exactly what you'd call the golden age of mental health awareness or social services. Medieval and early modern Britain was a place where people believed that dancing could cure spider bites, that bathing was potentially dangerous to your health, and that the best way to determine if someone was a witch was to see if they floated when you threw them in a river. In this context, hiring someone to eat your dead relative's sins suddenly doesn't seem quite so outlandish. Rural communities weren't quaint little villages where everyone knew each other's names and baked pies for newcomers. They were insular, superstitious places where survival often meant adhering to traditions that made about as much sense as pineapple on pizza. The local church controlled most aspects of daily life, but there were gaps in their services, particularly when it came to dealing with people who died in a state of sin or without proper last rites. If you thought modern bureaucracy was complicated, try navigating medieval salvation logistics. The church held the keys to heaven, and they weren't exactly handing out free passes. If your loved one died with unconfessed sins, unexpiated guilt, or just generally in the wrong spiritual state, their soul was basically stuck in supernatural limbo. This created a market demand for alternative solutions, and where there's demand, someone will eventually figure out how to supply it, even if that supply involves the most bizarre job description in human history. Enter the local economy of desperation. Communities had their blacksmiths, their bakers, their farmers, and their sin eaters. One of these jobs was not like the others, and it wasn't just because of the career prospects. While other trades might face seasonal fluctuations in demand, sin eaters had the ultimate recession-proof occupation. People never stopped dying, and they certainly never stopped dying with regrets. Meet Richard Munslow, quite possibly the professional sin eater in Britain who died in 1906. Now, Richard wasn't your typical social outcast. He was actually a farmer and merchant relatively well off by local standards. But here's where it gets interesting. He apparently took up sin eating not out of desperation, but out of genuine belief in its necessity. Richard was basically the Elon Musk of supernatural waste management, an entrepreneur who saw a neglected market and decided to corner it. Richard lived in Rattlinghope, Shropshire, a place so remote that GPS probably still has trouble finding it today. This wasn't London society we're talking about. This was the kind of rural community where the biggest excitement of the year was probably watching paint dry on the church door. Yet even in this sleepy village, the tradition of sin-eating persisted well into the 20th century, with Richard as its final practitioner. But here's the twist. Richard didn't just stumble into this career. According to local accounts, he became a sin-eater after 3 of his own children died in infancy. Imagine the grief and desperation that would drive someone to literally make a career out of consuming other people's spiritual burdens. It's like starting a business based on your own personal tragedy, except instead of selling inspirational books or founding a charity, you decide to eat sins at funerals. The specifics of Richard's practice were both fascinating and deeply unsettling. When someone died, he would be called to their home, where bread and salt would be placed on the deceased's chest or stomach. Richard would then eat this food, symbolically consuming the dead person's sins and taking them into himself. For this service, he was paid a small fee, essentially getting paid to condemn his own soul for someone else's benefit. It's customer service taken to an absolutely insane extreme. What makes Richard's story even more compelling is that he wasn't forced into this role by poverty or social circumstances. He chose it, presumably believing that someone needed to do this work, and he was willing to make the sacrifice. It's either incredibly noble or completely bonkers, depending on your perspective on supernatural logistics and the afterlife's bureaucratic requirements. The community's relationship with Richard was complicated, to put it mildly. They needed his services but didn't particularly want to associate with him socially. He was essential but untouchable, useful but undesirable. Imagine being the one person everyone in town depends on but nobody wants to have coffee with. Richard lived in this strange social limbo until his death, carrying not just his own sins, but theoretically those of everyone whose funeral he'd attended. This wasn't just about some quirky historical curiosity or medieval weirdness that we can laugh about from our enlightened modern perspective. The practice of sin-eating revealed deep anxieties about death, salvation, and social responsibility that went to the heart of how these communities understood their world and their place in it. For the families hiring sin-eaters, this was about more than superstition. It was about love, guilt, and the desperate human need to believe we can somehow help our loved ones even after death. When your mother died with harsh words unspoken, your father passed with debts unpaid, or your child left this world before they could confess their small sins, the sin-eater offered something precious, the possibility of redemption even after. It was too late for traditional salvation. The sin-eaters themselves occupied a unique and terrible position in society. They were necessary but despised, essential but isolated. They took on not just the symbolic sins of the dead, but the living guilt of entire communities. Every funeral they attended added another layer of spiritual burden to their souls, making them walking repositories of collective shame and regret. This system revealed the brutal pragmatism of communities that couldn't afford to lose anyone to eternal damnation, but also couldn't bear the weight of their collective guilt. They externalized their spiritual anxiety onto one person, essentially creating a human sacrifice to their own peace of mind. The sin-eater became a lightning rod for communal fear about death and judgment, absorbing the electrical charge of everyone else's spiritual terror. And if you think that's dark, wait until you hear about how this practice actually worked in day-to-day life, the kinds of people who ended up in this profession, and what happened to sin eaters when they themselves died. Because if eating other people's sins was complicated, figuring out who was going to eat the sin eater's sins was where things got really interesting. But Richard Munslow was just the end of a tradition that stretched back centuries, and he represented the relatively civilized version of what was often a much darker and more desperate practice. Throughout Britain and parts of Europe, sin eating took many forms, involved all kinds of people, and created social dynamics that would make a reality TV show look like a peaceful meditation retreat. The communities that employed sin eaters weren't just dealing with one eccentric individual who showed up at funerals with unusual dietary requirements. They were participating in a complex social system that involved specific rituals, detailed beliefs about how sin transfer worked, and elaborate workarounds for what happened when the whole thing went sideways. Think of it as a supernatural supply chain with all the logistical challenges that implies. And the sin eaters themselves weren't all like Richard Munslow. Many were far more desperate, far more isolated, and far more tragic figures whose stories reveal just how cruel communities could be to the people they depended on most. Practice of sin eating wasn't just about consuming bread and beer at funerals. It was about the systematic creation of human scapegoats and the complex social mechanisms that kept this bizarre tradition alive for centuries. So let's dive deeper into how this actually worked, who these people really were, and why entire communities thought this was not only acceptable but absolutely necessary. The actual mechanics of sin eating were both more elaborate and more pathetic than you might imagine. Unlike the common assumption that this was some sort of mystical ceremony performed by wise spiritual figures, the reality was more like hiring someone to perform the world's most morbid magic trick at the worst possible time. The sin eater was essentially a human garbage disposal for moral waste, and the ritual often looked more like someone desperately trying to earn a few coins by eating stale bread off a dead body. The practice wasn't standardized across different regions. There was no sin eater guild with official training programs and certification requirements. Instead, each community developed its own version based on local superstitions, available resources, and just how desperate their designated sin eater happened to be. Some areas used bread and salt, others preferred bread and beer, and some got creative with additional food items depending on what kind of sins needed consuming and what the family could afford. The theoretical foundation was actually quite sophisticated in a completely insane way. The belief was that sin could be transferred from one person to another through a ritual meal, with the sin eater voluntarily taking on the spiritual burdens of the deceased. This wasn't just about eating some ceremonial food. According to the belief system, the sin eater was literally absorbing the dead person's guilt, shame, and unconfessed wrongdoings into their own soul. It's like spiritual money laundering, except the currency was eternal damnation and the exchange rate was terrible. What made this particularly tragic was that sin eaters weren't just performing a role. They genuinely believed they were damning themselves for money. Imagine going to work every day knowing that your job description includes gradually destroying own soul for small change. It's customer service taken to the absolute extreme, where the customer is always right even when they're dead, and you're literally eating their problems. Take the case of a sin eater in Wales whose story was recorded by a Victorian folklorist. This particular individual, described only as a long, lean, awkward-looking man, would arrive at funerals carrying his own wooden bowl and spoon, because apparently bringing your own utensils to eat sins was just good professional practice. The family would place a loaf of bread on the deceased's chest, and sometimes salt or other food items around the body, creating what essentially looked like the world's most depressing charcuterie board. The sin eater would then eat this food in complete silence while the family watched, No prayers, no incantations, no mystical ceremony, just a desperate man eating bread off a corpse while everyone else stood around awkwardly. After finishing the meal, he would be paid his fee, typically sixpence to a shilling, and expected to leave immediately. No lingering, no social interaction, no thanks for consuming our dead relatives' sins. Would you like to stay for regular food? Just take the money and go, preferably by the back door so the neighbors wouldn't see him leaving. One account from the 19th century describes a sin-eater who had developed his own elaborate system for different types of sins. For minor offenses, like white lies or gossiping, plain bread would suffice. For more serious moral failures, he required bread and salt. For what he considered major sins, adultery, theft, serious betrayals, he demanded bread, salt, and ale, essentially creating a supernatural value menu for moral transgressions. It's like having a drive-through window for spiritual absolution, except the server was slowly destroying his own soul with every order. Another sin-eater, recorded in Shropshire records, allegedly had a reputation for being able to handle the sins of the most morally compromised individuals. He specialized in the difficult cases, people who had died with serious unconfessed sins, criminals, and those who had lived particularly dissolute lives. His rates were higher, but he was the person families called when regular sin-eaters weren't up to the task. Think of him as the specialist surgeon of supernatural waste management, except instead of saving lives, he was supposedly saving souls while destroying his own. The most tragic case involved a sin-eater who had been performing the ritual for decades and had become convinced that he was carrying the accumulated sins of hundreds of people. According to local accounts, he became increasingly paranoid and isolated, believing that he was the most damned person in the community. He allegedly kept detailed records of every funeral he had attended, every sin he had consumed, and every fee he had earned, as if he were maintaining an accounting ledger for his own damnation. This same individual reportedly tried to find another sin-eater to consume his sins when he felt death approaching, but nobody was willing to take on what they considered to be such an enormous spiritual burden. He died alone, and according to local legend, nobody was willing to eat his sins, leaving him as the ultimate spiritual dead end, a man who had spent his life consuming others' moral failures but couldn't find anyone willing to return the favor. The human element in these stories is heartbreaking. These weren't mythical figures or characters from folklore. They were real people, often living in extreme poverty, who genuinely believed they were trading their eternal souls for temporary financial relief. They were the ultimate example of economic desperation meeting religious terror, creating a perfect storm of exploitation disguised as spiritual service. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing involving medieval supernatural logistics ever was. The biggest complication was theological. If sin-eating actually worked, then it created a massive loophole in the entire Christian understanding of salvation and personal responsibility. If you could just pay someone to eat your sins, then what? Was the point of confession, repentance, or living a moral life? It's like having spiritual insurance where you could commit crimes all you wanted, as long as you had someone lined up to eat them after you died. This created a fascinating contradiction within communities that were supposedly deeply religious. They relied on Christian theology to justify their fears about unconfessed sins and spiritual damnation, but then employed a practice that completely undermined the basic principles of Christian salvation. It's theological doublethink at its finest, simultaneously believing that God required personal accountability for sin, while also believing that you could outsource that accountability to someone desperate enough to take the job. The church's position on sin-eating was officially disapproving, but practically complicated. Priests couldn't endorse a practice that made their services obsolete. but they also couldn't completely condemn something that brought comfort to their parishioners and didn't directly challenge church authority. So they maintained a policy of willful ignorance, don't ask, don't tell, and try not to think too hard about the theological implications of having a parallel salvation system operating in your parish. Even more contradictory was the social position of sin-eaters within their communities. People simultaneously believed in the necessity of their services and despised them for providing those services. It's like needing a plumber but being disgusted by plumbing. You want the problem solved, but you don't want to acknowledge how it gets solved or associate with the person doing the solving. The practice also created logical problems that nobody seemed interested in addressing. What happened if the sin-eater died before consuming someone's sins? Could sins be transferred multiple times, or was it a one-shot deal? If a sin-eater consumed the sins of someone who had also committed the sin of using a sin-eater, did that create some kind of recursive spiritual loop? These were the kind of questions that would keep medieval philosophers up at night, assuming any philosophers were willing to admit they were thinking about sin-eating in the first place. The result was communities that created elaborate systems of spiritual scapegoating while simultaneously pretending they had nothing to do with those systems. Families would hire sin-eaters, but they wouldn't acknowledge them socially. Churches would tolerate the practice while officially disapproving of it. Local authorities would look the other way while maintaining plausible deniability about what was happening in their jurisdictions. Sin-eaters themselves became living embodiments of their community's moral contradictions. They were essential but untouchable, necessary but unwelcome, helpful but horrifying. They lived on the margins of society, often in extreme poverty, surviving on the fees they earned from consuming other people's spiritual problems, while being blamed for the very practice that their communities had created and maintained. The psychological toll on sin-eaters was enormous. They weren't just performing a job, they were convinced they were gradually damning themselves for money. Imagine the mental health implications of genuinely believing that every day at work brought you closer to eternal torment. It's like being a suicide bomber, except instead of one dramatic explosion, you were slowly destroying yourself one funeral at a time. Communities dealt with this by treating sin-eaters as less than fully human. If you acknowledged that the person eating sins was a real person with real feelings and a real soul, then you had to confront the moral implications of what you were asking them to do. Much easier to treat them as a necessary evil, a tool for spiritual maintenance rather than a human being making enormous personal sacrifices for everyone else's peace of mind. The practice also created generational trauma within families of sin-eaters. Children grew up knowing that their parent was considered the most spiritually contaminated person in the community. They inherited not just poverty and social isolation, but also the belief that their family line was cursed with accumulated sins from countless strangers. Some communities saw sin-eating as hereditary, assuming that someone already damned might as well continue the family business. The long-term consequences were the gradual erosion of community cohesion through institutionalized scapegoating. When you create a system that allows people to transfer their moral responsibilities to someone else, you're essentially teaching them that accountability is optional as long as you can find someone desperate enough to take it on. It's moral hazard on a spiritual level. If you can always hire someone to eat your sins, why worry about committing them in the first place? Meanwhile, the practice of sin-eating wasn't happening in isolation. It existed alongside other medieval and early modern attempts to game the system of salvation and death, creating a whole underground economy of spiritual services that the official church couldn't or wouldn't provide. Where sin-eaters handled individual moral failures, other practices addressed different aspects of the terrifying uncertainty surrounding death and judgment. But the more we examine how sin-eating actually functioned in daily life, the more apparent it becomes that this wasn't just about individual desperation or local superstition. The practice revealed something much deeper and more disturbing about how communities dealt with collective guilt, social responsibility, and the fundamental human terror of mortality. The sin eater wasn't just eating bread and sins, they were consuming their entire community's moral anxiety, one funeral at a time. If the mechanics of sin eating were bizarre, then the social hierarchy it created was absolutely fascinating in the most horrifying way possible. While sin eaters occupied the bottom rung of society's ladder, they weren't just random outcasts. They were carefully maintained outcasts, deliberately kept in a state of controlled desperation to ensure their services remained available. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a company town, except instead of selling your soul to the company store, you were literally selling your soul at the company funeral. The social dynamics surrounding sin eating created what we might call a necessary, untouchable class. People who were essential to community functioning but had to be kept separate from normal social interaction to maintain the psychological distance required for the system to work. It's like having a waste management system where you need the garbage collectors but can't acknowledge them as fellow human beings, except the garbage was metaphysical and the collectors were sacrificing their eternal souls. This wasn't accidental. Social stratification, it was deliberate social engineering designed to solve a specific psychological problem. Communities needed someone to blame for their collective moral failures, but they also needed that person to be available when required. The solution was to create a permanent scapegoat class, maintained in just enough desperation to ensure compliance, but with just enough social support to ensure survival. The genius of this system was that it allowed communities to maintain their moral self-image while systematically exploiting the most vulnerable members of society. Everyone could sleep better at night knowing their deceased relatives' sins had been handled, and they could maintain their sense of moral superiority by looking down on the person who had made that peace of mind possible. It's virtue signaling, taken to its logical extreme, feeling righteous about your righteousness while paying someone else to handle your unrighteousness. Consider the case of Margaret Lee, a sin-eater from the Welsh borders whose story illustrates the complex social dynamics surrounding the profession. Margaret wasn't born into sin-eating. She became a sin-eater after her husband died, leaving her with several children and no means of support. The community offered her a choice: starve, beg, or take up the one occupation that nobody else wanted. She chose sin-eating, not out of religious conviction, but out of pure economic necessity. Margaret's situation was typical of how people entered the profession. Sin-eaters weren't called to their vocation by mystical visions or spiritual experiences. They were pushed into it by circumstances that left them with no other viable options. The community then treated this desperation as evidence of their moral unfitness for normal society, creating a perfect circular logic that justified continued exploitation. What made Margaret's case particularly interesting was how the community managed her social isolation. She was allowed to live in a small cottage on the outskirts of town, close enough to be summoned when needed, but far enough away to maintain social distance. She was permitted to shop for necessities, but only at specific times when fewer people would be around. She could attend church, but had to sit in the back and leave before everyone else. It was social management designed to maintain her availability while minimizing her visibility. The children in Margaret's community were specifically taught to avoid her, not because she was dangerous, but because association with a sin-eater could supposedly contaminate their own spiritual standing. This created a bizarre situation where children would cross the street to avoid the woman who was literally sacrificing her soul for their deceased grandparents' benefit. The irony was lost on everyone involved, or at least everyone pretended. It was. Another fascinating case involved John Davies, a sin-eater from Caernarfonshire. who developed what might be called a franchise model for sin eating. John realized that the demand for sin eating services exceeded what one person could handle, so he began training other desperate individuals in the practice, taking a percentage of their fees as payment for the training and ongoing support. It was multi-level marketing for the supernatural services industry. John's operation reveals how sin eating could become professionalized despite its marginal social status. He maintained territories for different sin eaters, developed standardized pricing, and even offered specialized services for different types of spiritual problems. Want someone to handle the sins of a person who died violently? That required a specialist sin eater trained in handling traumatic spiritual residue. Need someone for a suicide, which was considered the worst possible spiritual contamination? That called for John's most experienced operative and premium pricing. The most disturbing aspect of John's business model was how he recruited new sin eaters. He specifically targeted people who had lost everything: widows, orphans, people whose families had died in epidemics, individuals who had been ostracized for other reasons. He presented sin eating not as exploitation, but as an opportunity for redemption, a chance to serve the community despite their desperate circumstances. It was predatory recruitment disguised as spiritual opportunity. John's network also reveals how communities maintained plausible deniability about sin eating while ensuring the services remained available. By outsourcing the actual sin eating to John's organization, families could maintain that they weren't directly employing sin eaters. They were simply using a service provider who happened to specialize in supernatural waste management. It's like using a temp agency for your moral disposal needs. The relationship between John and his sin eaters was fascinatingly exploitative. He provided them with basic training, ongoing support, and territorial protection, but he also kept them dependent on his organization through a combination of debt and social isolation. Sin eaters in his network couldn't easily leave because they had nowhere else to go, and they couldn't work independently because John controlled access to most of the local market. It was spiritual sharecropping, technically voluntary, but practically inescapable. What makes these stories particularly tragic is how they reveal the systematic nature of the exploitation. These weren't isolated cases of individual desperation. They were examples of communities deliberately creating and maintaining systems that ensured a steady supply of people desperate enough to eat sins for money. The social machinery was designed to produce sin eaters, not just to use them. This wasn't isolated to a few eccentric communities or unusual historical circumstances. The pattern of creating necessary untouchable classes appears throughout history and across cultures, always following the same basic template. Identify a necessary but morally problematic function, designate a specific group to handle that function, then systematically isolate and stigmatize that group to maintain psychological distance from the moral implications of what you're asking them to do. The pattern in sin-eating communities was remarkably consistent. First, create a theological crisis that requires external solution, people dying with unconfessed sins. Second, develop a practice that addresses the crisis but requires someone to take on significant personal cost, eating sins and accepting spiritual damnation. Third, ensure that only the most desperate people are willing to take on that cost through systematic social and economic marginalization. Fourth, maintain the system by treating the sin-eaters as less than fully human, thereby avoiding moral responsibility for their exploitation. This pattern existed because it solved multiple psychological problems simultaneously. It addressed the community's spiritual anxiety about death and sin, provided a mechanism for transferring moral responsibility away from themselves, and created a permanent scapegoat class that could absorb all the guilt and shame associated with moral failure. It's a masterpiece of social engineering designed to make everyone feel better about themselves, except the people actually making the sacrifices. The economic component was crucial to maintaining the pattern. Sin eaters couldn't be too prosperous, or they might leave the profession but they couldn't be completely destitute, or they might die and leave the community without spiritual waste management services. The compensation was calibrated to maintain just enough desperation to ensure compliance, while providing just enough survival resources to ensure availability. What made this pattern particularly insidious was how it disguised exploitation as charity. Communities could tell themselves they were providing opportunities for society's most marginal members, offering them a way to serve despite their desperate circumstances. The sin eater wasn't being exploited. They were being given a chance to be useful, to contribute something meaningful to community life, even if they couldn't contribute anything else. The social isolation component served multiple functions. It maintained the psychological distance necessary for the community to avoid confronting the moral implications of what they were doing. It prevented sin eaters from organizing or demanding better treatment, and it reinforced the belief that sin eaters were fundamentally different from normal people. If they weren't isolated, people might notice that sin eaters were just ordinary people pushed into extraordinary circumstances by systematic social failures. The effects were far-reaching and largely invisible to the communities that created these systems. On the surface level, sin-eating appeared to solve the immediate problem of spiritual anxiety about death and unconfessed sin. Families could rest assured that their loved ones' souls had been properly handled, and communities could maintain their sense of collective moral standing. It was spiritual insurance that seemed to work exactly as advertised, but the deeper impact was the systematic erosion of moral responsibility and social cohesion. When you create mechanisms that allow people to transfer their moral burdens to someone else, you're essentially teaching them that accountability is optional. Communities that employed sin eaters were inadvertently training their members to see moral responsibility as something that could be purchased rather than something that required personal commitment and behavioral change. The psychological impact on community members was also significant, though largely unrecognized. Living in a society that maintained a permanent scapegoat class created unconscious anxiety about social standing and personal security. If the community was willing to systematically exploit sin eaters, what protection did anyone else have if their circumstances changed? The presence of sin eaters served as a constant reminder that social acceptance was conditional, and that anyone could potentially fall into the untouchable class if they became sufficiently desperate. Who benefited from this system? Primarily, the community's more prosperous members who could afford sin-eating services and who had the social standing to maintain distance from the moral implications of the practice. They got the spiritual benefits without having to confront the human costs, essentially enjoying the privileges of salvation without taking responsibility for the suffering required to maintain those privileges. Who suffered? Obviously the sin-eaters themselves, but also their families, their potential descendants, and anyone else who was vulnerable to falling into the category of necessary untouchables. The system created a template for systematic exploitation that could be applied to other groups and other problems, normalizing the idea that some people's suffering was acceptable if it served the broader community's needs. The unintended consequences were numerous and long-lasting. Communities that relied on sin-eating developed a tolerance for systematic inequality and exploitation that extended far beyond the specific practice. They learned to see certain types of suffering as necessary and acceptable, and they developed sophisticated psychological mechanisms for avoiding responsibility for that suffering. The practice also created intergenerational trauma within families and communities. Children who grew up in societies that maintained sin-eater systems internalized the message that some people were inherently less valuable than others, and that moral responsibility could be transferred to those people without consequence. These lessons shaped their understanding of ethics, social responsibility, and human worth in ways that extended far beyond their attitudes toward sin-eating specifically. Yet even as communities were developing these sophisticated systems of spiritual scapegoating, the practice of sin-eating was beginning to face challenges that would ultimately lead to its decline. The rise of literacy, improved communication between communities, and gradual changes in religious understanding were all creating pressures that would eventually make the practice unsustainable. But before we explore how sin-eating began to collapse, under the weight of its own contradictions, we need to understand what happened when the system worked too well, when communities became so dependent on sin-eaters that the practice began to take on a life of its own, creating crisis situations that nobody had anticipated and problems that the original practice was never designed to solve. Because when you build a system based on exploitation and moral evasion, it has a tendency to grow beyond your original intentions and create new problems that are even worse than the ones you were trying to solve. By the late 17th century, the practice of sin-eating had reached what we might call its peak dysfunction period, the point where communities had become so dependent on the system that they couldn't function without it. But the system itself had become so problematic that it was creating more problems than it solved. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a social media addiction. Everyone knew it was unhealthy, but nobody could figure out how to stop using it. The crisis centered around what historians now call the Great Sin-Eater Shortage of 1678-1682, though obviously nobody was calling it that at the time, because giving dramatic names to your social problems is a modern luxury. What happened was simple in concept but catastrophic in practice. Several communities in Wales and the Welsh borders simultaneously lost their sin-eaters to death, disease, or people finally coming to their senses and fleeing to places where eating other people's sins wasn't considered a legitimate career path. The problem was that these communities had become so dependent on sin-eating services that they had no backup plan for handling deaths without them. It's like if your entire town's waste management system was handled by one person who suddenly vanished, except instead of dealing with regular garbage, you were dealing with spiritual waste that everyone believed would contaminate their eternal souls, if not properly disposed of. The stakes were literally heaven and hell, and suddenly nobody was qualified to handle the disposal process. The crisis came to a head in the village of Llanganeull, a small Welsh community that had relied on the same sin-eater, Gwilym ap Thomas, for over 30 years. Gwilym was what you might call a professional's professional. He had developed his own specialized techniques, maintained detailed records of his services, and had even trained a backup sin-eater for emergencies. Then in the winter of 1679, both Gwilym and his backup died within 2 weeks of each other during a particularly nasty outbreak of what was probably influenza, though medical diagnosis in the 17th century was about as reliable as weather forecasting. By examining goat entrails, the community's immediate response was panic. They had 3 bodies awaiting burial, including a wealthy merchant who had died with significant unconfessed sins, apparently involving some creative accounting and a complicated relationship with his business partner's wife, and nobody qualified to handle the spiritual waste disposal. The families were refusing to bury their loved ones without proper sin-eating services, but there was literally nobody in the community willing or able to provide those services. What happened next reads like a medieval sitcom, except the laugh track was replaced by communal terror about eternal damnation. The village elders called an emergency meeting to address the sin-eater shortage, during which they made increasingly desperate attempts to recruit anyone, to take on the role. They started by offering double the usual fee, then triple, then threw in property rights and tax exemptions. Nobody was interested. The breakthrough came when Thomas Morgan, the village's most chronic debtor, finally agreed to become the new sin-eater in exchange for having all his debts forgiven and receiving a small cottage. Thomas wasn't particularly religious, wasn't especially desperate, and definitely wasn't qualified. He was just a guy who was really bad with money and saw an opportunity to solve all his financial problems in one dramatic career move. It was like declaring bankruptcy, except instead of ruining your credit score, you were potentially ruining your eternal soul. The problem was that Thomas had never actually seen a sin-eating ceremony performed. Gwilym had been very secretive about his methods, and the community had been so successful at socially isolating their sin-eater that nobody else knew exactly how the process worked. They knew it involved eating food that had been placed on or near the deceased, and they knew it required some kind of formal declaration of sin transference, but the specific details had died with Gwilym. So Thomas improvised, and his improvisation created what might be the most awkward spiritual ceremony in recorded history. Instead of the solemn, silent ritual that Gwilym had performed, Thomas treated the occasion like a dinner party. He arrived at the first funeral with a bottle of ale, proceeded to eat the ceremonial bread while making casual conversation with the grieving family, and concluded the ceremony by proposing a toast to the deceased's journey to heaven. The family was horrified, the other mourners were scandalized, and Thomas seemed genuinely confused about why everyone was upset. From his perspective, he was providing a service that made everyone feel better about death, so why shouldn't it be a more cheerful occasion? He was essentially trying to rebrand sin-eating as a celebration of life rather than a grim transfer of spiritual waste. Things got worse at the second funeral, where Thomas decided that if he was going to be eating sins, he might as well make it a proper meal. He brought additional food, invited the family to join him in eating, and suggested they could all share the burden of the deceased's sins, rather than placing it entirely on one person. It was communal sin-eating, a potluck approach to spiritual waste disposal that completely undermined the entire theological foundation of the practice. The community's response was swift and decisive. They fired Thomas immediately and demanded their money back. Thomas, who had already spent the debt forgiveness and was enjoying living in his new cottage, refused to return the payment and declared that he had performed the services as requested. The community was now stuck with a sin-eater who had possibly invalidated all the sin-eating he had performed, 3 bodies that may or may not have had their sins properly consumed, and a theological crisis that nobody was qualified to resolve. The situation became even more complicated when Thomas declared that since he had eaten everyone's sins, he was now the most spiritually contaminated person in the community, and therefore the most qualified person to continue eating sins. His logic was that if you're already damned, additional damnation doesn't really matter. It was spiritual bankruptcy protection for the eternally compromised. The community spent the next several months in a state of theological confusion, with families unsure whether their recently deceased relatives had been properly processed, or whether they needed to find another sin-eater to re-eat the sins that Thomas had possibly eaten incorrectly. Meanwhile, Thomas continued living in his cottage and occasionally offering his services to other communities, marketing himself as an experienced sin-eater with innovative approaches to traditional spiritual waste management. The response was immediate and revealed just how dependent these communities had become on their sin-eating systems. Word of the Langanyu disaster spread throughout the region, creating a panic among other communities who suddenly realized how vulnerable they were to sin-eater supply chain disruptions. It was like a bank run, except instead of withdrawing money, people were desperately trying to secure spiritual waste disposal services before the shortage spread. Several communities immediately began recruiting backup sin-eaters and implementing redundancy systems to prevent similar crises. Some areas established sin-eater apprenticeship programs, others created emergency protocols for sin-eater succession, and a few communities even attempted to recruit sin-eaters from other regions, leading to the first recorded instances of competitive bidding for spiritual waste disposal services. The immediate consequences in Langanai were both tragic and absurd. Families began delaying funerals while searching for qualified sin eaters, leading to practical problems with body storage during warm weather. Some families attempted to perform sin-eating ceremonies themselves, creating theological controversies about whether sin-eating required special qualifications or whether anyone could consume spiritual waste with proper technique. The situation attracted attention from religious authorities who had previously maintained a policy of willful ignorance about sin-eating practices. Local clergy found themselves forced to address questions they had spent decades avoiding. Was sin-eating theologically valid? Could sins be improperly consumed? What happened to souls whose sins had been eaten by unqualified sin-eaters? These were the kind of theological problems that kept medieval scholars awake at night, assuming they were willing to admit they were thinking about sin-eating in the first place. The broader regional impact was the first serious examination of sin-eating practices by educated outsiders. Scholars, clergy, and government officials who had previously ignored the practice as harmless rural superstition suddenly found themselves dealing with communities that were essentially non-functional due to spiritual waste management problems. It was like discovering that a significant portion of your population had been relying on a completely unregulated industry for essential services. Thomas Morgan's innovative approach to sin-eating also created unexpected theological discussions about the nature of the practice itself. His communal sin-eating concept, while horrifying to traditionalists, raised legitimate questions about why sin-eating had to be performed by a single individual rather than distributed among community members. If the goal was simply to remove sins from the deceased, why couldn't everyone share the burden instead of placing it entirely on one person? The economic consequences were also significant. The sudden shortage of sin eaters led to price inflation for spiritual waste disposal services, creating a seller's market for anyone willing to take on the job. This attracted people who were motivated primarily by financial opportunity rather than religious conviction or community service, leading to concerns about the commercialization of what had previously been treated as a sacred, if problematic, calling. This crisis wasn't just about one community's failure to maintain adequate sin-eater services. The Langanai W incident revealed fundamental problems with the entire system of sin-eating that had been masked by centuries of successful community management and willful ignorance about the practice's internal contradictions. First, it exposed how completely dependent some communities had become on practices that they couldn't even properly explain or replicate. The fact that nobody in Langanai W actually knew how sin-eating was supposed to work revealed that the practice had become ritualized to the point where form had completely replaced understanding. Communities were maintaining traditions without comprehending their theoretical foundations, which made them vulnerable to disruption when key practitioners disappeared. Second, the crisis demonstrated the inherent instability of systems based on systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Sin-eating worked as long as communities could maintain a steady supply of people desperate enough to take on the role, but it collapsed immediately when that supply was interrupted. The practice was entirely dependent on social conditions that maintained desperation and marginalization, making it vulnerable to any changes in those conditions. Third, the incident revealed how practices that seem harmless or even beneficial on the surface could create dangerous dependencies when communities became too reliant on them. Sin-eating appeared to solve the problem of spiritual anxiety about death, but it actually created new problems by making communities unable to handle death without external spiritual waste disposal services. Most importantly, the crisis forced communities to confront the moral implications of practices they had previously taken for granted. When sin-eating was working smoothly, people could ignore the human cost of the system and focus on the benefits it provided. But when the system collapsed and communities were scrambling to find new sin-eaters, the exploitation became visible and undeniable. The Llanganu incident became a cautionary tale about the dangers of creating social systems based on moral evasion and systematic scapegoating. It showed how communities could become trapped by their own attempts to avoid responsibility, creating dependencies that were ultimately more problematic than the original problems they were designed to solve. Around the main drama of sin-eating, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles in maintaining, exploiting, or occasionally trying to reform the practice. These weren't the sin-eaters themselves, but the people who made sin-eating possible, profitable, or problematic in ways that reveal just how complex and widespread the system really was. Meet Father Cadwallader Morris, a Welsh parish priest who developed what might be the most creative theological workaround in medieval history. Father Morris found himself in the impossible position of serving a community that relied heavily on sin-eating while being officially required to disapprove of the practice. His solution was masterful. He would perform regular funeral services, with all the proper Christian rituals, then leave immediately after the official ceremony concluded. What happened after his departure, whether families chose to employ additional spiritual services, was technically outside his jurisdiction and therefore not his responsibility. It was plausible deniability elevated to an art form. Father Morris even developed a special blessing that he would give at the end of funeral services, asking God to accept all offerings made in love and desperation for the peace of the departed soul. It sounded appropriately religious to anyone not familiar with sin-eating terminology, but it was actually a theological loophole that provided ecclesiastical cover for whatever sin-eating activities might follow. He was essentially blessing sin-eating without admitting he was blessing sin-eating, which probably required more theological creativity than most seminary education provided. Then there was Bronwyn Davies, who might be considered the world's first sin-eating entrepreneur. Bronwyn wasn't a sin-eater herself, but she recognized a business opportunity in the growing demand for sin-eating services and the chronic shortage of people willing to provide them. She became what we might call a sin-eating broker, connecting desperate families with available sin-eaters while taking a commission from both sides of the transaction. Bronwyn's operation was surprisingly sophisticated. She maintained a network of sin-eaters across multiple communities, provided them with basic training and standardized equipment, and even offered different service packages depending on the family's budget and the deceased's spiritual needs. Want a basic sin-eating for someone who died with minor moral infractions? That was her economy package. Need premium services for someone who died with serious, unconfessed sins? That required her specialist sin-eaters and cost accordingly. What made Bronwyn's business model particularly clever was how she insulated families from the moral implications of what they were purchasing. Instead of directly hiring sin-eaters, families could contract with Bronwyn's company for spiritual closure services, making the transaction feel more like hiring a funeral director than employing someone to damn themselves for your peace of mind. She was essentially the medieval equivalent of a spiritual waste management company, complete with professional branding and customer service protocols. Bronwyn also solved the practical problems that individual sin-eaters faced. She provided them with steady work, standardized pricing, and even basic healthcare services, mostly herbal remedies, and occasional visits from traveling physicians. In exchange, her sin-eaters gave her a percentage of their earnings and agreed to work exclusively within her network. It was the first recorded example of sin-eater unionization, though obviously nobody was using that terminology at the time. The most fascinating character in this ecosystem was probably Hywel Griffiths, a traveling merchant who specialized in selling supplies and services to communities that employed sin-eaters. Hywel recognized that sin-eating created specific logistical needs. special bowls and utensils, particular types of bread and salt, even specialized clothing for sin eaters who wanted to look more professional during ceremonies. He developed a traveling business that supplied these materials while also serving as an informal information network about sin-eating practices in different regions. Hywel's business revealed how much infrastructure surrounded the practice of sin-eating. Communities didn't just need sin-eaters, they needed proper equipment, appropriate ceremonial foods, and even specialized knowledge about different sin-eating techniques and their relative effectiveness. Hywel provided all of these services while maintaining careful neutrality about the practice itself. He was just a businessman serving a market demand, not someone making moral judgments about that demand. What made Hywel's operation particularly interesting was how he served as a communication network between different sin-eating communities. He carried news about successful practices, warned about problems like the Langaniw incident, and even facilitated the transfer of sin-eaters between communities when local supply and demand got out of balance. He was essentially running a medieval LinkedIn for the supernatural waste disposal industry. These weren't isolated incidents involving eccentric individuals. They were examples of how sin-eating created complex networks of relationships, dependencies, and mutual exploitation that extended far beyond the obvious connection between sin-eaters and the families who employed them. The practice generated its own ecosystem of supporting services, regulatory workarounds, and financial opportunities that revealed just how embedded it had become in the social and economic fabric of these communities. The connections between these characters illustrate how sin-eating had evolved from a simple folk practice into something resembling a small industry. Father Morris provided theological cover, Bronwyn supplied professional services and quality control, and Hywel handled equipment and information distribution. Together, they created a system that made sin-eating more accessible, more reliable, and more profitable for everyone involved except the sin-eaters themselves. The relationship between Father Morris and Bronwyn was particularly interesting because it demonstrated how religious and commercial interests could align around practices that both parties officially disapproved of. Father Morris needed plausible deniability to maintain his standing with church authorities, while Bronwyn needed some form of religious legitimacy to make her services acceptable to families who were already uncomfortable with the moral implications of hiring sin-eaters. Their solution was a careful dance of mutual non-acknowledgement. Father Morris would perform his official funeral services without any reference to what might happen afterward, while Bronwyn would market her services as supplementary, spiritual support rather than alternatives to proper Christian burial. Neither party directly acknowledged the other's role, but both benefited from the arrangement in ways that made their individual services more effective and more acceptable to their respective constituencies. Hywel's relationship with both Father Morris and Bronwyn reveals how information and resources flowed through these networks. He would carry messages between communities about effective sin-eating practices, warn about theological controversies or regulatory problems, and even facilitate the movement of personnel when one area had excess supply and another had urgent demand. He was essentially running a medieval consulting service for the supernatural waste disposal industry. The web of relationships also extended to local authorities who had to deal with the practical consequences of sin-eating without officially acknowledging the practice. Magistrates found themselves handling disputes between families and sin-eaters, property issues related to sin-eater housing, and even occasional criminal cases involving fraud or impersonation in sin-eating services. They developed informal protocols for handling these situations while maintaining official ignorance about what sin-eating actually involved. Perhaps most revealing were the relationships between different sin-eating communities and how they shared information, resources, and personnel. Communities that had successfully maintained their sin-eating systems would quietly provide advice and support to areas experiencing shortages or crises. This mutual aid wasn't formalized or officially acknowledged, but it created a regional network of communities that were all invested in maintaining the overall system, even when they were competing for limited sin-eater resources. The economic relationships were equally complex. Sin-eating generated income not just for the sin-eaters themselves, but for everyone who provided supporting services. Bronwyn's brokerage fees, Hyle's equipment sales, Father Morris's standard funeral fees, and even the local authorities' unofficial dispute resolution services all represented economic activity generated by the practice. Communities that abandoned sin-eating didn't just lose spiritual waste disposal services, they lost an entire economic ecosystem that had grown up around the practice. These interconnected relationships also created resistance to reform or elimination of sin-eating practices. Even people who were uncomfortable with the moral implications of the practice had economic or professional reasons for maintaining it. Father Morris needed the income from funeral services. Bronwyn had built her entire business around sin-eating demand, and Hyle had invested in specialized inventory and expertise that would be worthless if communities stopped employing sin-eaters. The result was that sin-eating became institutionally embedded in ways that made it difficult to eliminate, even when communities began to question its theological validity or moral acceptability. The practice had created its own constituency of people who benefited from its continuation, and those people had both the motivation and the resources to resist changes that would threaten their interests. To understand how sin-eating could become so embedded in community life that it generated its own supporting ecosystem, you have to understand the broader cultural context in which these practices developed and flourished. This wasn't happening in sophisticated urban centers with access to diverse religious and philosophical traditions. This was rural Britain and Wales in the 16th through 18th centuries, where information traveled slowly, education was limited, and most people's understanding of complex theological questions was filtered through local tradition and community consensus. Daily life in these communities was organized around survival, seasonal agricultural cycles, and maintaining social relationships that could provide support during crises. Death was a frequent visitor. Infant mortality was high, epidemic diseases struck regularly, and accidents, violence, and malnutrition claimed lives across all age groups. In communities where everyone knew everyone else, every death was both a personal loss and a community crisis that required collective response. The religious landscape was equally complicated. These were nominally Christian communities, but their Christianity was layered over much older folk traditions and supernatural beliefs that hadn't been eliminated by centuries of official religious instruction. People simultaneously believed in Christian salvation and pagan protective rituals, in the power of prayer and the effectiveness of charms and curses. Sin-eating fit perfectly into this syncretic religious environment because it addressed Christian concerns about sin and salvation while employing folk magic techniques that felt familiar and powerful. Social structures in these communities were based on networks of mutual obligation and reciprocal support that could be both protective and oppressive. Everyone had specific roles and responsibilities, but those roles were enforced through social pressure rather than formal authority. Being ostracized by your community wasn't just socially awkward. It could be a death sentence in environments where survival depended on collective cooperation. This made the social isolation of sin-eaters particularly cruel, but it also made their services more valuable because they represented one of the few ways that communities could manage collective guilt without requiring individual members to take personal responsibility. What was considered normal versus exceptional in these communities would seem bizarre to modern observers. It was normal for people to believe that curses could cause illness, that certain individuals had the power to predict death, and that the spirits of the dead could influence the living in concrete ways. In this context, the idea that someone could eat your sins and transfer them to their own soul wasn't particularly strange. It was just another example of how spiritual forces could be manipulated through proper technique and willing participation. Economic. Relationships were similarly intertwined with social and spiritual concerns. Most transactions involved barter or personal relationships rather than pure monetary exchange, and most services were provided within networks of mutual obligation,
rather than formal contracts.
Sin eating fit naturally into this system because it involved personal relationships, community obligations, and spiritual services that couldn't be easily quantified or regulated through formal mechanisms. Perhaps most fascinating was how communities that prided themselves on their Christian values and moral standards simultaneously maintained practices that completely undermined both Christian theology and basic moral principles. The same people who would condemn gambling, drinking, or sexual impropriety as threats to their souls would pay someone else to consume their spiritual waste without apparently noticing the contradiction. The irony extended to how these communities treated their sin-eaters. They simultaneously believed that sin-eaters were providing essential spiritual services and that sin-eaters were too morally contaminated to associate with socially. It's like believing that doctors are essential for health while also believing that medical knowledge inherently corrupts anyone who possesses it. The logical contradiction was obvious, but somehow everyone managed to ignore it. Even more contradictory was how communities that employed sin-eaters claimed to value personal responsibility and moral accountability. They taught their children about the importance of taking responsibility for their actions and living according to Christian principles, while also maintaining systems that allowed people to transfer their moral responsibilities to someone else for a small fee. It was moral education that came with an escape clause that completely negated the lesson being taught. The economic contradictions were equally apparent. Communities that struggled with poverty and resource scarcity somehow found money to pay for sin-eating services that provided no tangible benefits and actively harmed some of their most vulnerable members. They were essentially paying to make their own moral problems worse, while claiming to be solving them. Modern parallels to these contradictions are everywhere. Though we've gotten better at disguising them, we maintain systems that allow wealthy individuals and corporations to purchase carbon credits instead of reducing their environmental impact, essentially buying the right to continue polluting while transferring the responsibility for environmental cleanup to someone else. We employ private military contractors to handle military actions that we're uncomfortable acknowledging as acts of war. We outsource manufacturing to countries with lower labor and environmental standards, then express shock when we discover the working conditions in our supply chains. The sin-eater tradition represents the same fundamental human tendency to create systems that allow us to maintain our moral self-image while avoiding the costs of living according to our stated values. The specific mechanisms have changed, but the underlying psychology remains remarkably consistent. Everything changed when literacy rates began to rise and communities gained access to standardized religious texts instead of relying entirely on local oral traditions and the occasional visit from traveling clergy. This might sound like a gradual, peaceful transition toward enlightenment, but the reality was more like watching someone's worldview collapse in slow motion when they finally read the instruction manual and realized they'd been assembling their spiritual furniture completely wrong for centuries. The turning point wasn't dramatic. There was no papal decree against sin-eating, no royal proclamation banning the practice, no sudden theological revelation that made everyone simultaneously realize how bizarre the whole system was. Instead, it was the slow, grinding process of people becoming literate enough to read religious texts for themselves and discovering that nowhere in Christian theology was there any mention of transferring sins through ceremonial meals involving bread and dead bodies. This created what might be called the literacy crisis of sin-eating communities. For generations, most people had relied on local tradition and the word of community elders about what constituted proper spiritual practice. When the local wise woman or the village's most respected elder told you that sin-eating was necessary and effective, you generally believed them because they were your primary source of information about how the supernatural world operated. But literacy changed the information landscape in ways that made traditional practices vulnerable to scrutiny. People who could read began comparing their local customs to what they found in religious texts, and the discrepancies were both obvious and disturbing. It's like finally reading the user manual for a product you've been using for years and discovering that everything you thought you knew about how it worked was completely wrong. The background to this change was the broader Protestant Reformation's emphasis on individual access to religious texts and personal responsibility for spiritual salvation. Protestant theology specifically rejected the idea that spiritual authorities could transfer or absolve sins on behalf of other people, which made practices like sin-eating not just theologically questionable, but fundamentally heretical. This theological shift created new forms of spiritual anxiety that were actually worse than the original problems sin-eating was designed to solve. If individuals were personally responsible for their own salvation and couldn't transfer that responsibility to anyone else, then hiring sin-eaters wasn't just ineffective, it was potentially damaging to your own spiritual standing. Communities that had been using sin-eating to reduce their anxiety about death and judgment suddenly discovered that the practice might be making their spiritual situation worse rather than better. The key factors that led to this transformation included improved transportation and communication systems that allowed ideas to spread more quickly between communities, increased contact with urban areas where sin-eating wasn't practiced and was viewed as primitive superstition, and the gradual penetration of formal education into rural areas that had previously been isolated from broader intellectual currents. Why this moment was different from earlier questioning of sin-eating practices was that the challenges were coming from within the communities themselves rather than from external religious or political authorities. When your own neighbors started reading and questioning traditional practices, it was much harder to dismiss their concerns as outsider interference or attacks on local autonomy. The process of change unfolded differently in different communities, but it generally followed a predictable pattern that reveals how social practices can collapse once their underlying assumptions are seriously questioned. The transformation wasn't smooth or peaceful. It involved considerable social conflict, economic disruption, and personal trauma, as communities struggled to abandon practices that had been central to their understanding of death, morality, and social organization. Resistance to change came primarily from older community members who had the most invested in traditional practices and who were least likely to be literate enough to understand the theological challenges being raised. They had spent decades relying on sin-eating services, had organized their understanding of death and spiritual responsibility around the availability of those services, and weren't prepared to confront the possibility that their entire spiritual worldview might be based on fundamental misunderstandings. The resistance was both practical and emotional. From a practical standpoint, abandoning sin-eating meant that communities had to develop new ways of handling death and spiritual anxiety, without the safety net they had relied on for generations. From an emotional standpoint, accepting that sin-eating was ineffective or harmful meant confronting the possibility that all the sin-eaters who had died carrying other people's spiritual burdens had sacrificed themselves for nothing. Champions of change were typically younger community members who had learned to read and had access to religious texts, traveling merchants or craftsmen who had seen how other communities handled death without sin-eating services, and occasionally clergy who were finally willing to take public positions against practices they had previously ignored. These change advocates faced significant social pressure because they were essentially telling their neighbors that generations of ancestors had been wrong about fundamental spiritual questions. The specific steps of transformation usually began with informal questioning and discussion, progressed through community meetings where the theological status of sin-eating was debated, and culminated in formal decisions to discontinue the practice. But the process was complicated by the fact that communities couldn't simply vote to stop believing in sin transference. They had to develop alternative ways of managing the spiritual anxieties that sin-eating had been designed to address. Obstacles encountered during this transformation were numerous and often unexpected. Communities discovered that their sin-eaters had become economically dependent on the practice and couldn't easily transition to other forms of work. The supporting ecosystem of brokers, suppliers, and informal regulators also faced economic disruption as demand for their services disappeared. Even more challenging were the psychological obstacles. People who had relied on sin-eating services for peace of mind about deceased relatives found it difficult to accept that those services had been unnecessary or ineffective. Breakthrough. Moments often occurred when communities successfully handled deaths without sin-eating services and discovered that the spiritual catastrophes they had feared didn't materialize. When someone died without sin-eating and the community didn't experience supernatural retribution, it became easier to accept that the practice might not have been as essential as everyone had believed. The role of individuals versus larger historical forces in this transformation is fascinating because it reveals how social change can be simultaneously personal and systemic. Individual decisions by community members to question sin-eating practices were necessary for change to begin, but those individual decisions were enabled by larger social forces like improved literacy, better transportation, and changing religious understanding that made questioning possible and sustainable. Some communities attempted gradual reform rather than complete abandonment of sin-eating practices. They tried to modify the rituals to make them more theologically acceptable, reduced the fees paid to sin-eaters, or limited sin-eating to only the most desperate cases. These compromise approaches were generally unsuccessful because they didn't address the fundamental theological problems with the practice and often created new forms of confusion and conflict within communities. The most successful transformations occurred in communities that were able to replace sin-eating with alternative practices that addressed the same underlying spiritual anxieties. Some communities developed new funeral rituals that emphasized community prayer and collective responsibility for spiritual support of grieving families. Others increased their reliance on formal religious services and pastoral care from educated clergy. A few communities even developed secular approaches to death and grief that didn't require supernatural intervention at all. The transformation process revealed how deeply embedded sin-eating had become in community social structures. Abandoning the practice required more than just changing beliefs about sin transference. It required reconstructing social relationships, economic systems, and cultural practices that had been organized around the assumption that sin-eating was necessary and effective. The new system that emerged after communities abandoned sin-eating was simultaneously more and less complicated than what it replaced. On one hand, it was simpler because it eliminated the complex social machinery required to maintain sin-eaters and the elaborate theological justifications for practices that contradicted mainstream Christian teaching. On the other hand, it was more complicated because it required communities to take direct responsibility for managing spiritual anxieties and social conflicts that they had previously outsourced to scapegoats. The most obvious difference in the new reality was how communities handled death and funeral services. Instead of relying on sin-eaters to provide spiritual closure, families had to depend on formal religious services, community support networks, and their own resources for managing grief and spiritual concerns about deceased relatives. This placed greater demands on local clergy, who found themselves providing pastoral care services that had previously been handled by sin-eaters, and on community members who were expected to provide emotional and spiritual support to grieving families. The new system that emerged after communities abandoned sin-eating was simultaneously more and less complicated than what it replaced. On one hand, it was simpler because it eliminated the complex social machinery required to maintain sin-eaters and the elaborate theological justifications for practices that contradicted mainstream Christian teaching. On the other hand, it was more complicated because it required communities to take direct responsibility for managing spiritual anxieties and social conflicts that they had previously outsourced to scapegoats. The most obvious difference in the new reality was how communities handled death and funeral services. Instead of relying on sin-eaters to provide spiritual closure, families had to depend on formal religious services, community support networks, and their own resources for managing grief and spiritual concerns about deceased relatives. This placed greater demands on local clergy, who found themselves providing pastoral care services that had previously been handled by sin-eaters, and on community members who were expected to provide emotional and spiritual support to grieving families. Who won in this transformation? Primarily, former sin-eaters who were no longer required to sacrifice their spiritual well-being for community peace of mind, and community members who were freed from participation in a system that systematically exploited vulnerable individuals. The elimination of sin-eating also benefited local clergy, who no longer had to maintain the awkward balance between officially disapproving of the practice while tolerating it in their parishes. But the transition wasn't uniformly positive. Families who had relied on sin-eating services for generations found themselves struggling with spiritual anxieties that they no longer had any mechanism for addressing. The elimination of sin-eating forced people to confront their fears about death and spiritual responsibility directly, rather than transferring those fears to someone else, which was psychologically difficult for individuals who had never learned to manage such anxieties independently. Who lost in this transformation? The entire ecosystem of people who had built livelihoods around supporting sin-eating practices, brokers like Bronwyn Davies, suppliers like Hywel Griffiths, and various informal regulators and facilitators who had profited from the system. These individuals faced not just economic disruption, but social stigma for their previous involvement in practices that communities now viewed as exploitative and theologically invalid. The new rules and norms that emerged were based on Protestant principles of individual spiritual responsibility and formal religious authority. Communities developed new expectations about how death should be handled, what constituted appropriate spiritual support for grieving families, and how community members should relate to each other during times of crisis. These new norms were generally more egalitarian than the old system because they didn't require the creation of scapegoat classes, but they were also more demanding because they required everyone to take personal responsibility for spiritual and moral questions they had previously outsourced. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the complexity of social transformation. The fundamental human anxieties about death, sin, and spiritual responsibility remained unchanged. Communities still struggled with questions about what happened to people who died with unconfessed sins or unresolved moral failures. But the mechanisms for addressing those anxieties changed completely, shifting from external solutions provided by specialists to internal solutions that required personal and community spiritual development. The social relationships within communities
also changed significantly.
The elimination of sin-eating removed one of the primary mechanisms for creating and maintaining social hierarchy based on spiritual contamination. Former sin-eaters could potentially reintegrate into normal community life, though the process was often difficult due to decades of social isolation and economic marginalization. Economic relationships were similarly transformed. The money that had previously been spent on sin-eating services and supporting infrastructure was redirected toward other community needs, often including increased support for formal religious institutions and education. This represented a shift from private spiritual services purchased by individual families to public spiritual resources available to entire communities. Was this change positive? From almost any reasonable moral perspective, the elimination of sin-eating represented clear social progress. The practice had required communities to systematically exploit vulnerable individuals, created and maintained unnecessary social inequality, and provided no tangible benefits beyond psychological comfort based on theological misunderstandings. Abandoning sin-eating meant that communities stopped participating in organized scapegoating and began taking direct responsibility for their spiritual and social problems. Different perspectives on the transformation reveal the complexity of evaluating historical change. Former sin-eaters and their families generally viewed the change positively because it freed them from social isolation and spiritual exploitation. Community members who had been uncomfortable with the moral implications of sin-eating were relieved to abandon practices that contradicted their stated values. Local clergy appreciated the elimination of theological contradictions that had made their pastoral work more difficult. However, some community members viewed the change negatively because it eliminated a source of psychological comfort and spiritual security that they had relied on for generations. Families who had used sin-eating services to manage guilt and anxiety about deceased relatives found themselves struggling with emotions they no longer had any mechanism for addressing. The transformation forced people to confront spiritual questions they weren't prepared to handle independently. Short-term versus long-term effects of the change were dramatically different. In the short term, eliminating sin-eating created psychological distress for people who had relied on the practice, economic disruption for people who had profited from it, and social conflict as communities struggled to develop new norms and practices. But the long-term effects were largely positive. Communities developed more sustainable and equitable approaches to death and spiritual support. Individuals took greater personal responsibility for their spiritual development, and resources previously devoted to maintaining scapegoat systems were redirected toward more constructive purposes. Unintended consequences of the transformation included the loss of traditional folklore and cultural practices that had been associated with sin-eating, the economic displacement of people who had depended on the sin-eating ecosystem for their livelihoods, and occasional community conflicts when neighboring areas adopted different approaches to the transition. Modern judgment versus contemporary views of the change reveals how moral evaluation can shift over time. Contemporary observers generally viewed the elimination of sin-eating as progress toward more enlightened and rational religious practice, while modern observers are more likely to focus on the social justice implications of ending systematic exploitation of vulnerable community members. In the years and decades that followed the abandonment of sin-eating, communities discovered that eliminating a centuries-old social practice created unexpected ripple effects that extended far beyond the obvious changes to funeral customs and spiritual beliefs. The transformation revealed just how deeply embedded sin-eating had been in community social structures and how many other practices and relationships had been organized around the assumption that spiritual scapegoating was both necessary and effective. The most immediate development was what we might call the spiritual responsibility crisis of the early 18th century. Communities that had relied on sin-eating for generations suddenly found themselves confronting spiritual anxieties they had no experience managing directly. Families dealing with deaths involving unconfessed sins, unresolved conflicts, or moral failures that had previously been handled by sin-eaters now had to find alternative ways to achieve psychological closure and spiritual peace. Some communities responded by increasing their reliance on formal religious institutions, leading to a period of church building and clergy recruitment that represented a significant shift in how rural areas allocated resources for spiritual services. Instead of paying individual sin-eaters for private spiritual waste disposal, communities began investing in public religious infrastructure that could serve everyone's spiritual needs without requiring the systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Other communities developed secular approaches to death and grief that didn't require supernatural intervention at all. These areas saw the emergence of new social customs around funeral support, community grieving processes, and collective care for families dealing with loss. It was like discovering that you could handle difficult emotional situations through human support and practical assistance rather than magical thinking and scapegoating. The evolution of the situation also created new challenges that nobody had anticipated. Former sin-eaters found themselves in an awkward social position. They were no longer required to perform their traditional role, but they also weren't easily reintegrated into normal community life. Decades of social isolation and stigmatization had left many former sin-eaters without the social skills or economic resources needed to participate in regular community activities. Second-generation effects of the transformation included changes in how communities understood social responsibility, moral accountability, and collective problem-solving. Areas that had successfully eliminated sin-eating began to question other traditional practices that involved systematic inequality or exploitation. It was like removing one piece of problematic social machinery and discovering that other pieces were also unnecessary or harmful. The spiritual landscape also evolved in interesting ways. Communities that had abandoned sin-eating often developed more sophisticated theological understanding because they were forced to engage with religious questions directly rather than outsourcing them to specialists. People who had never thought seriously about sin, salvation, and spiritual responsibility suddenly found themselves discussing complex theological concepts and developing personal religious philosophies. New challenges emerged around how to handle the legacy of sin-eating practices. What should communities do about graves of deceased sin-eaters? How should they remember individuals who had sacrificed themselves for practices that were now viewed as harmful and unnecessary? These questions forced communities to confront the moral implications of their historical practices in ways that were often uncomfortable but ultimately valuable for developing more ethical social relationships. The post-sin-eating era saw the emergence of new important figures and institutions that filled some of the social functions previously served by sin-eaters, though generally in more equitable and theologically sound ways. These new players represented different approaches to handling the spiritual and social needs that sin-eating had addressed, and their success or failure revealed important lessons about sustainable alternatives to exploitative social practices. Perhaps most important were the traveling Methodist preachers who began serving rural communities that had previously relied on sin-eating. These preachers brought standardized religious education, formal theological training, and most importantly, alternative approaches to sin and salvation that didn't require scapegoating. Unlike the local clergy who had often tolerated sin-eating through willful ignorance, Methodist preachers actively challenged traditional practices and provided communities with theological frameworks for understanding why sin-eating was unnecessary and harmful. The Methodist approach was particularly effective because it addressed the underlying spiritual anxieties that had made sin-eating attractive while providing more empowering alternatives. Instead of teaching people that they needed to find someone else to handle their spiritual problems, Methodist theology emphasized personal relationship with God, individual spiritual development, and community support for spiritual growth. It was like replacing a broken waste disposal system with a recycling program that turned spiritual waste into spiritual growth. Another significant new player was the emergence of traveling physicians and early mental health practitioners who began to address some of the psychological functions that sin eating had served. These individuals, while not specifically focused on spiritual issues, provided alternative explanations for guilt, anxiety, and grief that didn't require supernatural intervention. They helped communities understand that many of the problems addressed by sin eating were actually psychological issues that could be handled through counseling, community support, and practical problem solving. The most fascinating new institution was the development of grief societies, voluntary associations of community members who provided structured support for families dealing with death and loss. These societies evolved organically in communities that had abandoned sin eating and needed alternative mechanisms for managing the social and emotional challenges surrounding death. Unlike sin eating, which isolated the spiritual burden on one individual, grief societies distributed the emotional labor of supporting bereaved families across multiple volunteers. How these new players differed from earlier participants in the sin-eating ecosystem was primarily in their approach to power and responsibility. Where sin-eating had concentrated spiritual authority in the hands of individuals who were then systematically marginalized, the new approaches distributed spiritual responsibility among community members and emphasized collective support rather than individual sacrifice. Their contributions to community spiritual life were generally more sustainable and equitable than what they replaced. Methodist preachers provided education and spiritual resources that could be shared by everyone, rather than services that were available only to families who could afford them. Traveling physicians offered explanations and treatments that empowered individuals to address their own psychological challenges rather than transferring those challenges to someone else. Grief societies created mutual support networks that strengthened community bonds rather than systems that required the systematic isolation of vulnerable individuals. The disruptions these new players created were mostly positive, though not without complications. Some traditional community leaders resented the challenge to their authority represented by Methodist preaching and medical explanations for problems they had previously handled through supernatural means. Former sin-eaters sometimes struggled to find their place in communities that were developing new approaches to the spiritual and social functions they had previously served. Specific stories about these new elements reveal how social change can create opportunities for innovation and improvement. Communities that had successfully transitioned away from sin-eating often became laboratories for developing more ethical and effective approaches to common human challenges around death, grief, guilt, and spiritual responsibility. But some problems persisted long after communities had officially abandoned sin-eating practices. The elimination of the practice didn't automatically resolve the underlying social dynamics and psychological patterns that had made sin-eating attractive in the first place, and communities discovered that creating more ethical alternatives to exploitative practices required sustained effort and ongoing vigilance. The most persistent challenge was what might be called the scapegoat impulse, the tendency for communities to seek someone to blame for collective problems rather than taking collective responsibility for addressing those problems. Even after sin-eating was abandoned, communities often found other ways to identify individuals who could be held responsible for spiritual, social, or economic difficulties that were actually systemic in nature. For example, some former sin-eating communities began targeting individuals with mental illness, physical disabilities, or unconventional religious beliefs as sources of spiritual contamination or community problems. The specific practice of sin-eating was gone, but the underlying psychology that had made it acceptable, the need to externalize guilt and responsibility onto vulnerable individuals, remained largely intact. What didn't get resolved was the broader issue of how communities should handle individual moral failures that affected collective well-being. Sin eating had provided a mechanism, however problematic, for addressing situations where someone's unconfessed sins or unresolved conflicts created ongoing anxiety for family members and community members. The elimination of sin eating left communities without clear alternatives for handling these situations. New versions of old problems emerged in the form of different practices that served similar psychological functions to sin eating, but avoided the most obvious theological and moral objections. Some communities developed elaborate funeral rituals that involved symbolic offerings or community prayers designed to ensure the spiritual well-being of the deceased, essentially creating collective sin eating that distributed the spiritual burden among multiple participants rather than concentrating it on one individual. Cyclical patterns appeared in how communities handled spiritual anxiety and collective guilt. Periods of strict personal responsibility and individual spiritual discipline would be followed by periods of seeking external solutions to spiritual problems, then back to emphasis on personal responsibility when the external solutions proved inadequate or problematic. It was like a spiritual pendulum that swung between different approaches to the same underlying human needs. Why certain issues proved intractable reveals important insights about the difference between changing practices and changing the underlying psychology that creates problematic practices. Communities could relatively easily stop employing sin eaters, but they struggled much more with developing sustainable alternatives to the psychological functions that sin eating had served: the need for spiritual security, the desire to avoid personal responsibility for moral failures, and the impulse to find simple solutions to complex spiritual and social problems. The continuing influence of sin-eating psychology could be seen in how communities handled other social challenges. Areas that had previously employed sin-eaters often showed similar patterns in their approach to poverty, crime, and social deviance, seeking to identify specific individuals who could be held responsible for systemic problems rather than addressing the underlying conditions that created those problems. Perhaps most troubling was the persistence of the social mechanisms that had originally created sin-eater classes. While communities no longer needed sin-eaters specifically, they continued to maintain social hierarchies and economic systems that created desperate, marginalized individuals who were vulnerable to exploitation for other purposes. The systematic creation of social scapegoats continued, even though the specific practice of sin-eating had been abandoned. These ongoing issues revealed that eliminating problematic social practices requires more than just changing specific behaviors. It requires addressing the underlying social structures, psychological patterns, and cultural values that made those practices seem necessary and acceptable in the first place. Compared to earlier periods when sin-eating was widely practiced and socially accepted, the post-sin-eating era represented significant progress in terms of social equity, theological sophistication, and community problem-solving approaches. Communities that had successfully transitioned away from sin-eating generally developed more sustainable and humane methods for handling death, grief, and spiritual anxiety than their predecessors had employed. Compared to other places that had never practiced sin-eating, the former sin-eating communities often showed both advantages and disadvantages in their social development. On the positive side, communities that had struggled with the moral implications of sin-eating and successfully eliminated the practice often developed more thoughtful and intentional approaches to social problems than areas that had never confronted such challenges. The experience of recognizing and abandoning a harmful traditional practice created communities that were more willing to question other, potentially problematic customs and more committed to developing ethical alternatives. On the negative side, former sin-eating communities often struggled with social cohesion and collective decision-making in ways that areas with more stable social traditions did not. The process of eliminating sin-eating had often involved significant community conflict. and had challenged traditional authority structures in ways that created lasting division and uncertainties about how communities should organize themselves. What was unique about the sin-eating tradition and its elimination was how clearly it revealed the psychological and social mechanisms underlying scapegoating practices. Most societies have developed ways to transfer collective guilt and responsibility onto individuals or groups, but sin-eating made these mechanisms unusually explicit and ritualized. The elimination of sin-eating therefore provided unusually clear insights into how such practices can be identified and eliminated. What was universal about the sin-eating experience was how it demonstrated the human tendency to seek simple solutions to complex moral and spiritual problems, and the willingness of communities to systematically exploit vulnerable individuals if it serves their psychological needs. These patterns appear across cultures and historical periods, though they often take different forms and involve different specific practices. Lessons that could be learned from the sin-eating experience included the importance of examining traditional practices for their underlying assumptions and moral implications, the need to develop sustainable alternatives before abandoning problematic practices, and the recognition that eliminating harmful social practices requires addressing the psychological and social conditions that created those practices in the first place. Patterns that repeated elsewhere included the development of professionalized scapegoating systems, the creation of supporting infrastructure around exploitative practices, and the resistance to change from individuals and institutions that benefited from existing systems. The sin-eating experience provided a template for understanding how such patterns develop and how they can be effectively challenged and eliminated. Most importantly, the transition away from sin-eating demonstrated that communities could successfully abandon harmful traditional practices and develop more ethical alternatives, but that such transitions required sustained effort, community education, and ongoing vigilance to prevent the emergence of new forms of the same underlying problems. By the mid-18th century, signs pointed to the inevitable decline of sin-eating as a viable social practice, though the communities that still employed sin-eaters were often the last to recognize what was happening. The warning signs weren't dramatic or sudden. They were the gradual accumulation of small changes that collectively undermined the social and psychological foundations that had made sin-eating possible for centuries. The most obvious early warning sign was the increasing difficulty communities faced in recruiting new sin-eaters. As literacy rates improved and economic opportunities expanded, fewer people were desperate enough to take on a role that involved social isolation, spiritual contamination, and systematic exploitation for minimal financial compensation. The deep pool of potential sin-eaters was shrinking, but communities were slow to recognize that this represented a fundamental shift rather than a temporary recruitment problem. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the complex dynamics
of social change.
Forward-thinking clergy and educated community members recognized that sin-eating was becoming increasingly incompatible with broader religious and social developments, but they often underestimated how dependent their communities had become on the practice for managing collective anxiety about death and moral responsibility. They saw the theological problems with sin-eating but missed the psychological functions it served. Conversely, traditional community leaders and families who regularly employed sin-eater services could see that the practice was becoming more expensive and less reliable, but they missed the broader social forces that were making these practical problems inevitable. They understood that individual sin-eaters were becoming harder to find and more demanding in their compensation, but they didn't recognize that these were symptoms of systemic changes rather than isolated personnel issues. Resistance to inevitable change came from multiple sources and took various forms. Some communities attempted to preserve sin-eating by improving the compensation and working conditions for sin-eaters, essentially trying to make systematic exploitation more attractive through better benefits packages, Other areas tried to maintain the practice by reducing its visibility, moving sin-eating ceremonies to more private settings, where they would be less likely to attract outside criticism or scrutiny. Perhaps most tellingly, some communities began developing hybrid practices that combined elements of sin-eating with more theologically acceptable religious rituals. These attempts at compromise revealed both the desperation to maintain familiar spiritual practices and the recognition that pure sin-eating was becoming unsustainable. It was like trying to preserve a dying language by incorporating it into a more widely spoken one, well-intentioned, but ultimately unsuccessful. The resistance also took the form of increased secrecy and insularity. Communities that continued practicing sin-eating became more closed to outside influence and more suspicious of newcomers who might challenge traditional practices. This defensive posture ultimately accelerated the decline of sin-eating by isolating practicing communities from the broader social and intellectual currents that could have helped them develop sustainable alternatives. Economic resistance involved attempts to commercialize and professionalize sin-eating services in ways that would make them more reliable and socially acceptable, but these efforts largely failed because they couldn't address the fundamental theological and moral problems with the practice. Making sin-eating more efficient didn't make it less exploitative or more spiritually legitimate. The actual end of sin-eating as a widespread social practice wasn't marked by any single dramatic event, but rather by a series of local extinctions that gradually eliminated the practice across the regions where it had been most common. The process was like watching a species go extinct, not through a single catastrophe, but through the gradual disappearance of the habitat conditions necessary for its survival. In most communities, sin-eating simply stopped when the last local sin-eater died and nobody could be found to replace them. Richard Munslow's death in 1906 in Rattling Hope marked what is generally considered the end of traditional sin-eating in Britain, but by that time the practice had already disappeared from most other areas where it had once been common. Richard represented the final holdout of a tradition that had been in decline for over a century. The specific events surrounding the end of sin-eating varied considerably between communities. Some areas experienced dramatic final conflicts between traditionalists who wanted to preserve the practice and reformers who demanded its elimination. These community battles often involved heated debates about theology, social responsibility, and the proper way to honor deceased community members, creating lasting divisions that persisted long after the sin-eating question had been resolved. Other communities experienced more gradual endings, with sin-eating practices slowly becoming less frequent and less elaborate until they eventually disappeared without any formal decision to abandon them. Families simply stopped calling for sin-eater services. Existing sin-eaters found other forms of employment or sources of support, and the practice faded away through lack of demand rather than active opposition. The final major players in the sin-eating tradition were often the most desperate and marginalized individuals, people who continued providing sin-eater services not because they believed in the practice, but because they had no other viable economic options. These final sin-eaters were typically older individuals who had been performing the role for decades and couldn't easily transition to other forms of work, or extremely poor people who were willing to take on any job that provided basic survival. Resources. Last attempts to preserve or revive sin-eating practices took various forms, most of which revealed how disconnected the tradition had become from the social conditions that had originally supported it. Some communities attempted to create honorary or ceremonial sin-eater positions that would preserve the ritual elements of the practice without requiring individuals to actually sacrifice their spiritual well-being. These attempts generally failed because they eliminated the very elements of sacrifice and spiritual transfer that had made sin-eating psychologically effective for the communities that employed it. Other preservation efforts involved attempts to document sin-eating practices. for historical purposes or to incorporate elements of sin-eating into broader folk revival movements. While these efforts succeeded in preserving knowledge about how sin-eating had functioned, they couldn't recreate the social conditions and genuine spiritual beliefs that had made the practice seem necessary and effective to earlier generations. The dramatic final moments of sin-eating were often more pathetic than dramatic. The last sin-eaters typically died alone and unmourned, their deaths barely noted by communities that had once depended on their services. There were no ceremonial, final sin-eating events, no formal announcements that the tradition was ending, no community celebrations of successful transition to alternative practices. The practice simply stopped, leaving behind only fragmentary records and fading memories. Some areas experienced what might be called false endings, situations where sin-eating appeared to have died out, only to be briefly revived during periods of crisis or social upheaval. These revivals were typically short-lived and unsuccessful because they occurred in social contexts that no longer supported the beliefs and practices that had made sin-eating viable. Symbolic endpoints varied between communities but often involved the death of individuals who had served as repositories of traditional knowledge about sin-eating practices. When the last person who remembered how sin-eating was supposed to work died without passing that knowledge to someone else, the tradition effectively ended regardless of whether communities had formally decided to abandon it. The end of sin-eating represented more than just the elimination of a particular folk practice. It marked the conclusion of a centuries-long experiment in systematic scapegoating that had shaped community social structures, religious understanding, and approaches to collective problem-solving in ways that extended far beyond the specific practice itself. The analysis of why sin-eating ended reveals multiple interconnected causes that made the practice increasingly unsustainable as social, economic, and intellectual conditions changed throughout the 17th and 18th centuries. Understanding these causes provides insights not just into the specific history of sin-eating, but into the broader patterns of how exploitative social practices can be eliminated and what conditions are necessary for such transformations to succeed. Internal problems with sin-eating had been accumulating for generations before the practice finally collapsed. The most fundamental internal contradiction was theological. Sin-eating required communities to simultaneously believe in Christian doctrines of personal spiritual responsibility and in folk magic practices that completely undermined those doctrines. As literacy improved and people gained direct access to religious texts, this contradiction became increasingly difficult to ignore or rationalize. The practice also faced growing internal economic problems. Sin-eating had always been economically marginal for the individuals who performed it, but it became even less attractive as alternative economic opportunities became available. The rise of wage labor, expanded trade networks, and improved transportation systems meant that even the most desperate individuals had options other than accepting social isolation and spiritual contamination for minimal compensation. External pressures came from multiple sources and accelerated throughout the 18th century. Religious authorities who had previously tolerated sin-eating through willful ignorance became more actively opposed to the practice as Protestant theology emphasized individual spiritual responsibility and direct relationship with God. Government officials and educated observers increasingly viewed sin-eating as evidence of primitive superstition that reflected poorly on their regions and populations. Perhaps most importantly, broader social changes were eliminating the conditions that had made sin-eating psychologically necessary for communities. Improved education, better communication systems, and increased contact with urban areas provided people with alternative frameworks for understanding death, sin, and spiritual responsibility that didn't require scapegoating mechanisms. The role of individuals versus historical forces in ending sin-eating illustrates the complex interaction between personal choices and structural changes in creating social transformation. Individual decisions by community members to question sin-eating practices were necessary for change to begin, but those individual decisions were enabled and supported by larger historical forces that made alternatives to sin-eating both available and attractive. What could have been done differently to preserve sin-eating reveals the fundamental unsustainability of the practice. While communities could have provided better compensation for sin-eaters, improved their social treatment, or developed more sophisticated theological justifications for the practice, these changes wouldn't have addressed the basic moral problems. With systematic scapegoating or the growing incompatibility between sin-eating and broader social development, the question of inevitability versus contingency in the end of sin-eating is fascinating because it highlights how some social practices become unsustainable once certain threshold conditions are met, once literacy rates reached a certain level, once alternative economic opportunities became available, and once theological alternatives to scapegoating were widely known, sin-eating became very difficult to maintain regardless of how much individual communities might have wanted to preserve it. The end of sin-eating was probably inevitable given the broader social, economic, and intellectual changes occurring in 18th century Britain, but the specific timing and manner of its elimination varied considerably between communities depending on local conditions, leadership, and the availability of alternative practices that could serve similar psychological functions. The immediate aftermath of sin-eating's elimination was marked by a curious combination of relief and nostalgia that revealed just how complicated communities' relationships with the practice had always been. While most people were glad to be free from participation in systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals, many also felt a sense of loss about abandoning traditions that had provided psychological comfort and cultural continuity for generations. In the immediate period following the end of sin-eating, communities often experienced what might be called spiritual anxiety rebound, the return of fears and concerns about death and unconfessed sin that sin-eating had been designed to address. Families who had relied on sin-eater services for generations suddenly found themselves confronting spiritual questions they had no experience handling directly, leading to temporary increases in religious activity and demand for pastoral care services, who stepped into the vacuum left by eliminated sin-eating practices varied considerably between communities, but generally included local clergy, voluntary support organizations, and informal networks of community members who took on responsibility for providing emotional and spiritual support to grieving families. These alternative sources of support were generally more sustainable and equitable than sin-eating, but they required communities to develop new social skills and institutional structures. Short-term consequences of eliminating sin-eating included economic disruption for the individuals and businesses that had depended on the practice, social conflict between community members who supported different approaches to the transition, and temporary confusion about how death and funeral services should be handled. These immediate problems were generally manageable, but they required active community effort to resolve. Contemporary reactions to the end of sin-eating revealed the complex and often contradictory attitudes that communities had maintained toward the practice. Many people expressed relief that they were no longer participating in systematic exploitation, but some also worried about the spiritual implications of abandoning traditional practices and the practical challenges of developing alternatives. Religious authorities generally welcomed the end of sin-eating as eliminating a practice that had created theological problems and pastoral complications, but they also recognized that they would need to provide more intensive spiritual support services to replace the functions that sin-eating had served. This led to increased emphasis on pastoral care, religious education, and community-based approaches to spiritual development. Attempts at revival or continuation of sin-eating were generally unsuccessful because they occurred in social contexts that no longer supported the beliefs and practices that had made the tradition viable. Occasional efforts to preserve sin eating as historical curiosity or folk practice failed because they couldn't recreate the genuine spiritual beliefs and social conditions that had made the practice psychologically effective for earlier generations. The immediate legacy period also saw increased interest in documenting and studying sin-eating practices among scholars and folklorists who recognized that an important, if problematic, cultural tradition was disappearing. These documentation efforts preserved valuable information about how sin-eating had functioned, but they also contributed to romanticizing the practice in ways that obscured its exploitative aspects and social costs. The legacy of sin-eating shaped later developments in ways that extended far beyond the specific communities where the practice had been employed, influencing broader understanding of social responsibility, religious practice, and the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective well-being. While sin-eating itself disappeared, the social dynamics and psychological patterns it had revealed continued to influence how societies approached similar challenges for generations. One of the most significant historical impacts was how the sin-eating experience contributed to evolving understanding of systematic exploitation and social justice. Communities that had successfully eliminated sin-eating often became more sensitive to other forms of institutionalized scapegoating and more committed to developing equitable alternatives to exploitative practices. The recognition that traditional practices could be both culturally important and morally problematic created a template for examining other social institutions and customs. The specific influences of sin-eating on later religious and social developments included increased emphasis on individual spiritual responsibility, greater attention to the moral implications of traditional practices, and more sophisticated understanding of how psychological needs could be addressed through community support,
rather than individual sacrifice.
Protestant denominations, in particular, used the sin-eating example to illustrate the importance of personal relationship with God and the dangers of transferring spiritual responsibility to other individuals. Later generations viewed sin-eating through various lenses that reflected their own social concerns and intellectual frameworks. Victorian scholars often romanticized the practice as an example of primitive folk wisdom, while early anthropologists used it to support theories about the evolution of religious practices. Modern historians have been more likely to focus on the social justice implications and the insights sin-eating provides into systematic exploitation and community psychology. The myths versus realities that developed around sin-eating reveal how historical practices can be distorted through selective memory and cultural projection. Popular accounts often emphasize the mysterious and exotic aspects of sin-eating, while downplaying its exploitative elements and human costs. This romanticization made it easier to view sin-eating as harmless folklore rather than as an example of systematic community exploitation of vulnerable individuals. Why sin-eating remained important in some contexts while being forgotten in others reflects broader patterns of historical memory and cultural transmission. Academic and folklore communities maintained interest in sin-eating as an example of traditional British customs and religious practices, while the communities that had actually employed sin-eaters were often more interested in forgetting practices they had come to view as embarrassing or morally problematic. The practice's influence on understanding of scapegoating mechanisms was particularly significant. Sin-eating provided unusually clear and well-documented examples of how communities could systematically transfer collective guilt and responsibility onto individual members, creating templates for recognizing and analyzing similar patterns in other social contexts. Anthropologists, sociologists, and psychologists have used sin-eating as a case study for understanding how scapegoating functions and how it can be eliminated. The impact on religious studies was equally important. Sin-eating demonstrated how folk religious practices could persist alongside official theological teachings, how communities could maintain contradictory belief systems simultaneously, and how spiritual needs could be addressed through practices that completely undermined official religious. Modern parallels, 600-700 words. Today, we can see echoes of sin-eating in numerous modern examples that reveal how little has changed about human psychology and social dynamics despite centuries of technological and social progress. While we no longer hire people to literally eat sins off dead bodies, we've developed remarkably sophisticated systems for transferring moral responsibility and guilt onto other individuals and institutions in ways that serve similar psychological functions. The most obvious parallel is in how wealthy individuals and corporations use carbon credits and environmental offsets to purchase the right to continue polluting while transferring responsibility for environmental cleanup to other parties. It's essentially industrial sin-eating. Instead of changing behavior that creates problems, organizations pay others to absorb the consequences of that behavior. The psychological mechanism is identical. Maintain your lifestyle while outsourcing the moral burden to someone else who is desperate enough to accept it for money. Corporate social responsibility programs often function as modern sin-eating operations. Companies that engage in questionable labor practices, environmental destruction, or financial exploitation can purchase moral legitimacy through charitable donations, sustainability initiatives, and public relations campaigns that transfer attention away from their harmful activities. The charity work serves the same psychological function as sin-eating. It allows organizations to maintain problematic practices while feeling virtuous about their overall impact. The gig economy has created new forms of systematic exploitation that mirror the sin-eater dynamic. Platform companies like Uber, DoorDash, and Amazon have found ways to transfer the risks and costs of their business operations onto individual workers who are desperate enough to accept precarious employment without benefits, job security, or fair compensation. The companies maintain plausible deniability about exploitation by classifying workers as independent contractors rather than employees, essentially creating modern sin-eater classes. Private military contractors represent another form of institutionalized sin-eating. Governments can engage in military actions that would be politically unacceptable if performed by official military forces by outsourcing those actions to private companies. This allows political leaders to maintain plausible deniability about controversial activities while transferring the moral burden onto individuals who are willing to accept it for financial compensation. The mental health and social services. Systems often function as modern sin-eating mechanisms for dealing with social problems. Instead of addressing the systemic causes of homelessness, addiction, mental illness, and poverty, societies often focus on managing the symptoms through specialized professionals who absorb the human costs of collective failures to create equitable social and economic systems. Social media platforms have created new mechanisms for collective scapegoating that serve similar functions to traditional sin-eating. Online communities can identify individuals to blame for collective problems, directing rage and frustration onto specific targets in ways that allow everyone else to feel virtuous while avoiding responsibility for systemic issues. Cancel culture, while sometimes addressing legitimate grievances, can also function as a form of digital sin-eating where communities transfer their collective guilt onto individuals who become symbols of broader problems. What hasn't changed about human nature is the fundamental desire to avoid personal responsibility for moral and social problems while maintaining a positive self-image. People still want simple solutions to complex problems, still prefer to blame individuals rather than address systemic issues, and still seek ways to transfer their guilt and anxiety onto others who are vulnerable enough to accept that burden. Similar, Patterns in different contexts appear throughout modern society. The basic template of identifying desperate individuals who can be paid to absorb collective problems while being systematically isolated and stigmatized remains remarkably consistent. Whether it's migrant workers who handle dangerous and unpleasant jobs, overseas manufacturing workers who produce goods under conditions that would be unacceptable in wealthy countries, or service workers who absorb the emotional labors of dealing with frustrated customers, the sin-eater dynamic persists. Lessons for contemporary issues include the recognition that moral problems require moral solutions rather than technical fixes, that sustainable approaches to social problems must address underlying causes rather than just managing symptoms, and that systems based on systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals are inherently unstable and ultimately harmful to everyone involved. The sin-eating tradition teaches us that communities can become dependent on exploitative practices in ways that make them resistant to change, even when the moral problems with those practices are obvious. Modern societies should examine their own systems for similar patterns and work to develop alternatives before crises force change in more disruptive ways. The key takeaways from the sin-eating tradition extend far beyond historical curiosity to provide crucial insights about human psychology, social organization, and moral responsibility that remain relevant for contemporary challenges. Understanding how sin-eating functioned and why it persisted for centuries offers important lessons about recognizing and addressing similar patterns in modern society. Perhaps the most important universal truth revealed by sin-eating is how easily communities can rationalize systematic exploitation when it serves their psychological needs. People who would never consider themselves capable of deliberately harming others can participate in systems that cause significant suffering if those systems are presented as traditional, necessary, or beneficial to the broader community. The sin-eating tradition demonstrates how moral blindness can be institutionalized and perpetuated across generations. Warnings for today include the recognition that modern societies maintain numerous practices that serve similar functions to sin-eating, but are disguised through more sophisticated language and institutional structures. When we see systems that systematically benefit some groups while imposing costs on more vulnerable populations, we should examine whether we're participating in updated versions of the same basic exploitation that made sin-eating possible. The inspirational elements of the sin-eating story include the demonstration that communities can successfully recognize and eliminate harmful traditional practices when they develop the courage to examine their own behavior honestly and the commitment to develop more equitable alternatives. The transition away from sin-eating shows that social change is possible even when it requires confronting deeply embedded practices and belief systems. Practical lessons from the sin-eating experience include the importance of examining traditional practices for their underlying assumptions and moral implications, the need to develop sustainable alternatives before abandoning problematic systems, and the recognition that lasting social change requires addressing the psychological and social conditions that create demand for exploitative practices rather than just eliminating the practices themselves. Why this history matters now is that it provides a framework for understanding how seemingly beneficial or harmless social practices can actually be forms of systematic exploitation that harm both the individuals directly involved and the broader community that participates in them. Sin-eating offers a clear example of how moral problems disguised as spiritual solutions can persist for centuries before being recognized and addressed. The sin-eating tradition also demonstrates the importance of literacy, education, and critical thinking in enabling communities to evaluate their own practices and develop more ethical alternatives. The communities that successfully eliminated sin-eating were generally those that had access to broader sources of information and alternative frameworks for understanding their social and spiritual challenges. Most importantly, the sin-eating experience teaches us that moral progress requires more than just good intentions. It requires sustained effort to examine our own behavior, the courage to abandon practices that serve our psychological needs but harm others, and the commitment to develop alternatives that address underlying human needs in more equitable and sustainable ways. The lesson is not that traditional practices are inherently bad, but that all social practices, traditional and modern alike, should be subject to ongoing moral evaluation, and that communities have both the capacity and the responsibility to eliminate practices that systematically harm vulnerable individuals, regardless of how those practices are justified or how long they have been maintained. Even now, sin-eating influences multiple areas of contemporary life and thought in ways that are often unrecognized but significant for understanding modern social dynamics and moral challenges. The practice continues to serve as a reference point for discussions about scapegoating, social responsibility, and the relationship between individual sacrifice and collective well-being. Academic study of sin-eating has contributed to broader understanding of folk religious practices, systematic exploitation, and the psychology of moral responsibility. Anthropologists, sociologists, religious studies scholars, and historians continue to use sin-eating as a case study for examining how communities manage collective guilt, how traditional practices can persist despite contradicting official belief systems, and how social change occurs in response to moral recognition. Popular culture has occasionally referenced sin-eating in literature, film, and television, though these references often romanticize or misrepresent the practice in ways that obscure its exploitative elements. These cultural representations reveal ongoing fascination with the idea of transferring guilt and responsibility to others, suggesting that the psychological appeal of sin-eating remains relevant for contemporary audiences. Political discourse sometimes invokes sin-eating metaphors when discussing scapegoating, blame-shifting, and the tendency for individuals and institutions to avoid responsibility for collective problems by identifying specific targets who can absorb criticism and consequences. The sin-eating tradition provides useful language for describing these dynamics and for critiquing modern forms of systematic exploitation. Social movements concerned with economic justice, environmental protection, and social equity often reference patterns similar to sin-eating when analyzing how wealthy individuals and corporations externalize the costs of their behavior onto more vulnerable populations. The historical example of sin-eating provides a framework for understanding how such systems function and how they can be challenged and eliminated. Why people still care about sin-eating reflects broader contemporary concerns about social justice, moral responsibility, and the need to recognize and address systematic exploitation in modern society. The practice serves as a historical example that helps people understand how communities can become complicit in harm while maintaining their moral self-image, and how that complicity can be overcome through education, moral courage, and commitment to developing more equitable alternatives. The continuing relevance of sin-eating demonstrates that historical practices can provide valuable insights for contemporary challenges, and that understanding how exploitative systems functioned in the past can help us recognize and address similar patterns in the present. Looking back across the centuries-long history of sin-eating, we've seen a practice that began as a folk solution to spiritual anxiety evolve into a sophisticated system of systematic exploitation, then gradually collapse under the weight of its own contradictions and changing social conditions. The journey from the desperate individuals who first agreed to eat others' sins for small coins to the final sin-eaters, like Richard Munslow, reveals both the consistency of human psychological needs and the dramatic evolution of how societies attempt to address those needs. The key patterns that emerge throughout this history include the tendency for communities to seek simple solutions to complex moral problems. the willingness to systematically exploit vulnerable individuals when it serves collective psychological needs, and the resistance to change even when the moral problems with existing practices become obvious. Sin-eating communities developed elaborate social machinery to maintain practices they knew were problematic, demonstrating how institutional momentum can perpetuate harmful systems long after their original justifications have disappeared. Our most surprising discoveries include how sophisticated and widespread sin-eating practices became, how they generated entire ecosystems of supporting services and institutions, and how difficult they were to eliminate even after communities recognized their moral problems. The practice wasn't just a quaint folk custom maintained by a few isolated communities. It was a systematic social institution that shaped economic relationships, religious understanding, and community organization across large areas for centuries. The most important takeaways from the sin-eating tradition include the recognition that moral problems require moral solutions rather than technical fixes, that systematic exploitation can be disguised as beneficial social services, and that communities have both the capacity and the responsibility to examine their own practices and eliminate those that cause harm, regardless of how traditional or psychologically comforting they might be. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration reflects the complexity of evaluating historical practices that served real psychological functions while causing significant harm. Initially, sin-eating might appear to be simply an example of primitive superstition that disappeared naturally as societies became more educated and rational. But deeper examination reveals it as a sophisticated system for managing collective guilt and anxiety that created patterns of exploitation and moral evasion that continue to influence modern society. The sin-eating story demonstrates that historical practices can't be dismissed simply as products of ignorance or primitiveness. They often represent complex responses to genuine human needs that persist across time and cultures. Understanding why sin-eating was attractive to communities and individuals helps us recognize similar patterns in contemporary society and develop more effective approaches to addressing the underlying needs that exploitative practices claim to serve. Perhaps most importantly, the sin-eating tradition illustrates that social change is possible even when it requires abandoning deeply embedded practices and confronting uncomfortable truths about community complicity in systematic harm. The communities that successfully eliminated sin-eating proved that people can overcome institutional momentum, psychological comfort, and economic interests when they develop sufficient moral courage and commitment to creating more equitable alternatives. The journey through sin-eating history ultimately reveals both the worst and best aspects of human social organization. Our capacity for creating elaborate systems of exploitation and our ability to recognize and overcome those systems when we choose to examine our own behavior honestly. Perhaps most revealing about human nature, sin-eating exposes the fundamental tension between our stated moral values and our psychological needs for comfort, security, and moral certainty. Communities that prided themselves on Christian compassion and moral integrity simultaneously maintained practices that required systematic exploitation of their most vulnerable members, demonstrating how easily people can rationalize behavior that contradicts their core beliefs when it serves their emotional needs. What stays constant across centuries and cultures is the human desire to find simple solutions to complex problems, particularly when those problems involve guilt, responsibility, and anxiety about death and moral failure. People consistently seek ways to transfer difficult emotions and moral burdens to others rather than confronting them directly, and they're willing to pay significant costs, financial, social, and moral, to maintain systems that provide psychological relief even when those systems cause harm. The sin-eating tradition reveals how communities can become psychologically dependent on practices that they intellectually recognize as problematic. Even when people understood that sin-eating was theologically questionable and morally troubling, they continued to support it because it provided emotional comfort that they couldn't find elsewhere. This pattern appears throughout human history. In various forms, people maintain harmful practices because they serve important psychological functions, even when better alternatives are theoretically available. What changes across time and context is primarily the sophistication of the mechanisms used to disguise or justify exploitative practices rather than the underlying psychology that creates demand for such practices. Modern societies have developed more complex language and institutional structures for transferring moral responsibility and exploiting vulnerable populations, but the basic human motivations remain remarkably consistent. How people adapt to moral contradictions is particularly fascinating in the sin-eating context. Communities developed elaborate psychological mechanisms for avoiding confrontation with the implications of their own behavior. Compartmentalization that allowed them to see sin-eaters as essential while treating them as untouchable, rationalization that portrayed exploitation as charity, and selective attention that focused on benefits while ignoring costs. Universal struggles revealed by the sin-eating tradition include the difficulty of taking personal responsibility for collective problems, the challenge of developing sustainable solutions to complex social issues, and the resistance to change when existing systems serve important psychological functions despite their moral problems. These struggles appear in every society and historical period, though they manifest through different specific practices and institutions. Timeless motivations that drove sin-eating include the fear of death and judgment, the desire to help deceased loved ones, the need to manage guilt and anxiety about moral failures, and the wish to maintain community harmony and individual peace of mind. These motivations remain powerful in contemporary society, though they're typically addressed through different mechanisms than hiring someone to eat sins off corpses. The sin-eating experience demonstrates that human moral development is possible, but requires sustained effort and often external pressure to overcome psychological resistance to change. Communities eliminated sin-eating not because they suddenly became more enlightened, but because changing social conditions made the practice unsustainable and provided alternative frameworks for addressing the needs it had served. Perhaps most importantly, sin-eating reveals that moral progress occurs through the gradual recognition that practices serving our psychological needs can simultaneously cause significant harm to others, and that sustainable moral development requires finding ways to address those needs that don't require systematic exploitation of vulnerable individuals. The capacity for this recognition and the willingness to act on it despite psychological comfort and institutional momentum may be among the most important aspects of human moral potential. Let me leave you with one final story that encapsulates everything we've explored about sin-eating and what it reveals about human nature, community dynamics, and moral responsibility. This story comes from the records of a Welsh parish in the early 18th century, during the final period when sin-eating was disappearing from most communities but still persisted in isolated areas. An elderly woman named Megan Lloyd had served as her community's sin-eater for over 40 years, taking on the role after her husband died and left her with 3 young children to support. She had eaten the sins of hundreds of deceased community members, absorbed their guilt and moral failures, and carried the collective spiritual burden of several generations. By all accounts, she was good at her job. Families reported feeling genuine peace after her services, and she had developed refined techniques for handling different types of spiritual contamination. But as Megan aged and her health declined, the community faced the same crisis that was occurring throughout the region. Nobody was willing to replace her. The younger generation had learned to read, had been exposed to different religious ideas, and understood that sin-eating contradicted basic Christian theology. They weren't desperate enough to take on systematic spiritual contamination for small amounts of money, and they weren't isolated enough to believe that such contamination was necessary or inevitable. When Megan fell seriously ill in the winter of 1724, she sent word to the community leaders asking them to arrange for someone to eat her sins when she died. This created an unprecedented crisis. The person who had absorbed everyone else's spiritual waste needed someone to handle her accumulated spiritual burden, but she had become so spiritually contaminated through decades of sin-eating that nobody was willing to take on what they viewed as an impossible task. The community's response reveals everything about how sin-eating functioned as a system of organized moral evasion. They offered increasing amounts of money to potential sin-eaters, contacted surrounding communities to find specialists who might be willing to handle such a challenging case, and even considered dividing Megan's sins among multiple sin-eaters to make the burden more manageable. But ultimately, nobody was willing to eat the sins of someone who had spent her life eating other people's sins. Megan died alone in her cottage, and according to local records, she was buried without sin-eating services. The community that had depended on her for 4 decades couldn't find anyone willing to provide the same service for her that she had provided for them. It was the ultimate expression of how sin-eating created disposable people, essential when needed, abandoned when inconvenient. What this story reveals about the broader themes we've explored is how communities could simultaneously depend on individuals while treating them as less than fully human, how practices that seemed to solve problems actually created larger problems, and how systems of moral evasion ultimately trapped everyone involved. Megan's community had created a person who was too spiritually contaminated to help, but too important to ignore, and they had no framework for resolving the contradiction they had created. The story also reveals the profound human cost of systematic scapegoating. Megan had sacrificed her social relationships, her spiritual peace, and ultimately her hope for spiritual redemption to provide psychological comfort for others. And when she needed help, the same system that had used her abandoned her completely. This final image encapsulates the tragedy and the lesson of the entire sin-eating tradition. Communities that solve their problems by creating disposable people ultimately discover that the problems weren't really solved. They were just transferred to someone else who would eventually need help that nobody was willing to provide. In the end, sin-eating reminds us that the line between helping others and exploiting them can be much thinner than we want to believe, and that practices justified as beneficial or necessary can actually be forms of systematic harm disguised as social services. The communities that employed sin-eaters genuinely believed they were providing opportunities for useful service and spiritual benefit, but they were actually creating human sacrifice systems that destroyed the people they claimed to help. The connection to modern life is both obvious and unsettling. We live in societies that maintain elaborate systems for transferring the costs and consequences of our lifestyle choices onto people who are desperate enough to accept them for money. We outsource environmental damage, labor exploitation, and social problems to populations that are vulnerable enough to absorb them, then maintain psychological distance from the human costs of our comfort and convenience through the same mechanisms that sin-eating communities use to avoid confronting their participation in systematic exploitation. What we should remember from the sin-eating tradition is that moral problems require moral solutions, that sustainable approaches to human challenges must address underlying causes rather than just transferring symptoms to other people, and that communities have the responsibility to examine their own practices for patterns of systematic harm, regardless of how those practices are justified or how psychologically comforting they might be. How history informs the present is by providing examples of how exploitative systems function, how they can persist despite their obvious moral problems, and how they can eventually be eliminated when communities develop sufficient courage and commitment to change. The sin-eating experience demonstrates that social transformation is possible, but requires sustained effort to overcome psychological comfort, economic interests, and institutional momentum. The final thought-provoking observation from our journey through sin-eating history is that the practice succeeded precisely because it addressed real human needs in ways that seemed effective and beneficial to the communities that employed it. The psychological comfort, spiritual security, and social cohesion that sin-eating provided were genuine benefits that help explain why the practice persisted for centuries, despite its obvious moral problems. This suggests that eliminating modern forms of systematic exploitation will require more than just moral criticism. It will require developing alternative approaches that address the underlying human needs that exploitative practices claim to serve. We need systems that provide psychological security, social cohesion, and practical solutions to human challenges without requiring the systematic sacrifice of vulnerable individuals. The sin-eating tradition ultimately teaches us that sustainable, moral progress requires both the courage to abandon practices that cause harm and the creativity to develop alternatives that address genuine human needs in more equitable ways. It's not enough to recognize exploitation, we must also be willing to do the harder work of creating systems that serve human flourishing without requiring anyone to be disposable. As we reach the end of this exploration into one of history's strangest professions, it's worth taking a moment to appreciate the complexity and tragedy of the human story we've uncovered together. The sin-eaters who consumed other people's guilt and shame for centuries weren't just historical curiosities. They were real people making impossible choices in systems designed to exploit their desperation while providing comfort for everyone else. Their story reminds us to examine our own practices and institutions for similar patterns, to question systems that seem to benefit us at others' expense, and to remember that moral progress requires ongoing effort rather than just good intentions. The sin-eating tradition ended not because people suddenly became more enlightened, but because communities eventually developed the courage to confront uncomfortable truths about their own behavior and the commitment to create more equitable alternatives. Tonight, as you reflect on this journey through the world of sin-eating, consider what lessons this strange and troubling practice might hold for understanding our own time and our own choices. Sometimes the most important history is the kind that makes us uncomfortable about the present.